Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
How
not
heroic
fucking
he
idiot.
comes
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
So, welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson, and with me today is, to me, a special guest. I was able to get an advanced copy of the book we're going to talk about, and I really enjoyed what was in it. And so, with me today is Michael Sturza. Michael's been a lifelong socialist political activist and labor organizer. He studied Marxism at the State University of New York at Buffalo in the mid-'70s, and I studied philosophy in college, but really that was like a cover for doing Marx, because so I had to do 19th century philosophy because it wasn't, I don't think it was as quite on the tip of everyone's tongue in 2004 as it was maybe in the late 60s, early 70s. But then Michael went on to work in labor activism, particularly with the CWA, the Communication Workers of America, and then the American Federation of Municipal and State Employees, AFSCME. And originally from New York City. Michael still lives and studies and writes there, but upon, I think, a well-earned retirement in 2014, done a lot of traveling, and I think most notably for our conversation, a 9-week trip to London, York, Edinburgh, and Dublin. I think that on a trip that I've seen described for you that reinforced the belief in the social nature of the English Revolution. And I think the book that we're going to talk about, The London Revolution, 1640 to 1643, coming out from the Mad Duck Coalition that Michael wrote, is, I think, an attempt to push back against sort of standard historiography around the English Civil War and the Revolution that does excise the class basis and class nature of what was going on there. So I'm really excited to talk about this. So Michael, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know you did say that you might be less interested in your own personal bio and more on talking about the book, but I want to make sure if there's anything we didn't cover about your bio that you think would be relevant to kind of framing the book, and we want to talk about or hit.
Well, I just would like to clarify that while I was active in the labor movement to some degree, I was never officially a representative of either of the unions that I was in. I was doing work amongst my co-workers around particular cases or political issues. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes labor organizing takes the form of actually being a person who works for the union whose specific goal is organizing labor, new unions.
Sure.
And other times a labor organizer is really just making sure that the laborers are in themselves politicized and organized. I know you did stuff with Mumia and other things like that I thought was, that's the politicization of workers is, I think, a thing that is too often taken out of the notion of a labor organizer and is too confined to the idea of simply organizing unions. And so I wanted to give you the credit where credit's due.
Not that organizing unions is unimportant by any means.
Of course, right. So as we think about the English Civil War, the English Revolution, and its relationship to me to the sort of the way I understand the rise of capitalism, it's been my own take, and I think a lot of times the sort of Marxist position or something that, even in some ways for simplicity's sake, that the sort of movement from feudalism into capitalism seems to center around the French Revolution rather than the English Civil Wars, or definitely what was going on in the Netherlands, because I think that doesn't as easily conform with what was going on with the rest of Europe. And so I think partially that's because the French Revolution is kind of identifiable, it's revolutionary, it's a kind of obvious end of feudalism in terms of like a single knight of like with, getting rid of feudal privileges and things like that, that really make it kind of an easy flashpoint for understanding this transition period from feudalism to capitalism. But so as we kind of introduce your book and what you're talking about and what's of interest to you, to me, it's kind of discussing the rise of capitalism in England, and I wonder how you see that as either how it differs or how it is similar to the rise of capitalism in the rest of Europe.
Well, it's a very good point. The English bourgeois revolution was an even more contradictory phenomena than the French. There was no systematic suppression of the aristocracy as a whole, for example. There was no land given to the peasants. The French Revolution was longer delayed by absolutism and therefore was a much more explosive event. Marx did consider England the classic example of capitalist development. And I believe that there are two main reasons for that, and this is what my book talks about. One is that absolutism never fully took hold in England. The monarchy was attenuated by a parliament that developed during the 13th century and grew out of the Barons' Rebellion in 1215 and Magna Carta. Mm-hmm. The other reason was the early end of villeinage or serfdom as a result of the 1381 Peasants' Rebellion, which did not last very long, but was incredibly explosive, especially for its day, and spread throughout eastern England, all the way up to the southern portion of Yorkshire. What changed as a result of that was that villeinage was replaced by copyhold, and this became general eventually, and it replaced feudal obligation to the lord with bourgeois payment, rent, essentially a capitalist contract. The peasants were freed from bondage to the land. They could now sell any surplus they were able to produce. They were given written title to the land. Their labor obligations to the lord was largely abolished. And their descendants could inherit the farm upon payment of a large fine or fee. By custom, rents were low. But this enormous change allowed market relations to spread in the countryside throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. The fact that there was no large-scale warfare in England after 1485, when the Tudors first came to power, gave time for capital to accumulate. And during the same period, aristocrats turned to raising sheep for the wool export trade to the Low Countries. So all of this contributed to the agrarian or countryside growth of market and spread of market relations in England.
So
English, let me just add, I'm sorry,
Sure.
let me just add that this was really different from France. English aristocrats, especially gentry, who participated in the capitalist economy, did not cease to be aristocrats. They were still part of the feudal ruling class. But what it did mean was that their interests largely aligned with those of the bourgeoisie. This was something that never happened in France.
Mm. And I think when we think about the process of the primitive accumulation that is like necessary for it's sort of industrial capitalism to take off eventually, and you see industrial capitalism really taking hold in England in many ways before other places. It seems to relate to this, right? You've got a longer period in England of these kind of market relations and the growth of, it's a constrained in a way that Europe isn't by it's like the fact that it's an island, and so it needs to develop a kind of merchant class, and you talk about that a lot too. And so I'm curious a bit to like get a background about that. I mean, I think the role of the kind of, you have like market relations that develop early, and you've got a kind of capitalistic or bourgeois kind of form of that because you've got rent land and wage labor and stuff like that very early than you have others. But you've got this development of like a powerful merchant orientation in terms of going abroad and even to England and then eventually to the sort of new world. And I guess I'm curious how that either again makes England a different animal than the rest of the world, or maybe how that relates to, you know, the Dutch were also doing something similar. I'm curious, at least how you see how that makes the experience in England unique.
Yeah, well, I'm a lot less familiar with Holland than I am with England, but certainly similar things were happening there. But it was very tied up with their war for national liberation from Spain. So again, there's very different. It's a different situation that we should probably, you know, might want to talk about in another episode or something. But yes, so in England, both production and overseas trade expanded enormously as early as the 16th century, particularly in the second half under Elizabeth. Most of this trade, however, was by royally chartered monopoly commercial what they call joint stock companies, which were very limited to, you know, 50 or 60 investors who were members, typically, and who were given a monopoly to trade with some particular country or area, such as the Levant or the East India Company, of course, as being the most famous.
Were they usually like nobles? That were the people who were kind of able to enter into this joint stock company?
Some of them, well, some of the nobles did invest in foreign trade. Yes, that's absolutely true. But the majority of them were simply bourgeois merchants.
Gotcha.
Now, they're sometimes called the merchant princes because they were fabulously wealthy and they controlled the trade lock, stock, and barrel. But aristocrats also invested, as well as investing in things like mining and shipbuilding, urban housing. Again, the gentry in the same period were beginning to improve their estates, particularly because they were impelled by inflation, which of course also affected the nobility. But they could just raise money by from the rich merchants in London, and they could not be arrested if they didn't pay their debts. So it was they had other alternatives. But the gentry did not have that privilege, although they had many others. And so they began to look at new crops and techniques, or developing iron and lead mining or processing on their lands. They consolidated or expanded their lands, and most of all, they enclosed their lands. Which was the most direct way for them to make improvements. The peasants, as a result, the copyhold tenants, were driven off, either through higher rents, shorter leases, or loss of the commons. This put the gentry, or that portion of it which was interested in investing and managing capitalist enterprise, with a foot in two different social systems, capitalism and feudalism, which could not indefinitely coexist. It was a very odd situation for them. And it made them more moderate and conservative in their opposition to the king. The peasants who were thrown off the land mostly migrated to towns, especially London, and served as a pool of desperately poor casual labor. Day laborers. Again, given the economic expansion, there was an enormous increase in the numbers of small and medium urban craftsmen, members of guilds, which were called livery companies, the most successful of whom were able to go into money lending and become even richer. But most of these people in this stratum, they were called the middling people. They were petty bourgeois artisans, small retailers, domestic traders, and for the most part, they were Puritan, and many of them were became radically Puritan. And this was the base of support that really drove the revolution, not the moderate gentry. It was the occupation of London streets by the armed people that made this a revolution and caused the king to flee.
Yeah, so I mean, it might be worthwhile, even like as difficult as it may be, to kind of sketch the historical kind of facts and things like that to understand what you sort of mean by the London Revolution in particular, and how it fits in with the larger, fight against the king and the relations thereof. But maybe as a way of doing that, the as Americans, we have this very kind of unique view of the Puritans, as they are, right? That they're often this kind of religious zealots that we kind of have this story that we hear that they were, like, not, they didn't get along well in England, and that's the kind of like very broad cover that we hear in, history class in, our elementary and middle and high school, even, about, the Puritans. They got kicked out of England, and then they went to the Netherlands, and they didn't do well there, and they thought, well, we're just going to go to the New World and do our own thing, and what they become is these kind of like the early purveyors of like religious freedom, and but also like religiosity in America, thinking that America is this, land of opportunity and or shining city on a hill, and these kind of like mythos creations of America that relate back to Puritans. But they're much more like a much more interesting group of people, and they play a much different historical role, particularly in England, as you kind of alluded to just now. And so, as maybe, I don't know this how easy this might be, but like the role of the Puritans, like you said, almost being kind of ground soldiers of a revolutionary period in England, is a different image than we have of the homesteading, coming over on the Mayflower people that I think most Americans envision. So I'm hoping maybe that you can, one, sketch a bit of what we're actually talking about in terms of the events that are happening and the role that the Puritans play in that, so that we can give at least those Americans who are listening a different picture of who the Puritans were.
Okay, so Puritanism began as an influential minority in the Church of England around the time of Edward VI. What they really were consistent Protestants or Orthodox Protestants. They wanted to remove anything that smacked of Catholicism in the Church of England. Even under Elizabeth, the church was a largely conservative compromise between Catholic superstition and hierarchy versus Protestant rationality and individualism. By the time of Charles I, Puritanism had a general effect throughout the society. It was not everybody was Puritans, and the name Puritan was often decried, even by many Protestants. So it's kind of dependent on how you defined it. But under Charles, anybody who opposed, who was for reformation of the church, was driven out. And sometimes they were driven out of England. So that by 1640, the Puritan movement in London was demanding the abolition of the Episcopal Church, that is, ruled by the bishops. Church and state were heavily intertwined. The king was the head of both. An abolition of the church hierarchy would mean the fall of the monarchy. So Puritanism in this period is a revolutionary movement against feudalism. Now, again, the degree to which Puritanism influenced various people depended, but it was a trans-class movement. But it was the middling people who were the most radical in their religion and therefore in their politics. And it had a great effect. There was a new development that occurred during the late 1620s and 30s because suddenly there was free trade to the colony in Virginia. And anyone with some capital could now engage in trade of tobacco, import of tobacco, under the rough and ready conditions of free trade. And this produced a new group of wealthy Atlantic merchants who grew up. And unlike the older merchant princes, they were not beholden to the king for their profits. On the contrary, they were quite radical. They were known as independents. They had allied with Puritan aristocrats to found new colonies for Puritan refugees, such as Massachusetts Bay. And it was these guys who became leaders of the Puritan movement in London, who had extensive, I mean, they were quite wealthy, but they had extensive ties to the middling class producers and retailers. They backed Parliament with money and administrative expertise. They pushed for active prosecution of the war against the king. They were the bourgeois vanguard of the revolution. And it was their political alliance with the gentry in the House of Commons that gave the gentry confidence that they could control the petty bourgeois Puritan middling class movement.
That's like, to me, that's the idea of Puritans as a revolutionary group is sort of like, to me, there's at least in the more maybe critical version of thinking about Puritans in America, they're very like, again, religious zealots who you know, maybe, I don't know, have a kind of very conservative perspective, and I think maybe religiously.
Well, many of them were religious zealots.
Yeah.
But their political program was objectively revolutionary. I mean, yes, many of them were millenarians who believed that the kingdom of Jesus was around the corner. Well, that was obviously not about to happen, but the belief in it was not a myth. That was real. And that harnessed to the political program against feudalism for abolition of the church, which in effect meant abolition of the state, because it was, after all, a state church. That made it revolutionary, and led by the Atlantic merchants, who were pro-free trade. You begin to see how this is a program that promotes the capitalist system at the expense of the feudal political system.
Right, because like because you think about the difference between a free trade system on the Atlantic side as well as compared to a very constrained and controlled. Right? You hear something like a joint stock company and you think, oh, that's very capitalistic, but really these like state-based monopolies are a means by which to kind of continue or entrench control and the ability for wealth and the accumulation within the already like established political elite. And whereas you have a free trade, that opens it up to like anyone who's interested, and I think changes that dynamic in terms of you kind of have the like you kind of make this distinction between the Atlantic side of things and the rest of it in terms of how that develops in terms of like political perspectives as it relates to, I think, specifically the king, but also the church.
Yes, exactly. The royally chartered monopoly companies were intimately tied to the feudal system. They provided the king with money through customs duties and loans and gifts, and they also occupied all of the high offices in the towns, and most particularly in London, as self-perpetuating oligarchies. They were in political control of the cities, of the town. They weren't really cities, most except for London, but the larger towns. So free trade was a very revolutionary concept. To the old line merchants, all they had to do was buy cheap in the Mediterranean or the Spice Islands in the East Indies, ship it back to England and sell high. And they controlled the number of investors, they controlled the conditions, they controlled how much was brought in, all to keep profits high. It was a highly regulated economy and very limited, so that the better off merchants of the middling people, members of the livery companies and so on, who had some capital that they wanted to invest, were completely excluded. And this was the major division up until around 1640 within the capitalist business class.
Well, I think that that's, there's, I think for especially younger people who are reading the Communist Manifesto or something for the first time, you have that phrase in there where everything, one of the things that capitalism is kind of revolutionary about is that it's boiling all of these old feudal constraints and privileges and all that to this one main mantra: free trade, right? And you read that as somebody in 2011 or 2020 as like, oh, they're just like neoliberals. And like, well, it's like, kind of in some sense, but like what we're really talking about, I think it's really obvious in, if you look at the ancien regime in France, in terms of the kind of duties needing to be paid of like all these different ways of like through feudal lands or something like that, all these checkpoints, these customs duties within a country and something like that. And so this notion of free trade, as you're saying, is extremely revolutionary at a time when you like part of one of the sort of thing that defines the feudal system is it's like absolute control on economic relations, that there isn't this kind of ability to freely engage in like wholly market conditions. Although, like you were saying, there's a long development of markets in England, they're still highly constrained, highly controlled markets. And so when you introduce an idea that's like, if you can raise the capital and do the work, more power to you, that is a different relationship to production and distribution that, in that Marxist sense, is going to produce in you sort of different political ideas, different social ideas and cultural ideas that will butt up against consistent and already existing notions. And I wanted one thing that is revolutionary about the bourgeoisie as compared to the old feudal is that they have this like almost single mantra that free trade is this kind of economic base that you can then build on top of superstructure that we would actually identify today as, the kind of world in which we live in. And so,
well, yeah, it was revolutionary in the 17th century when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher brought it back. It was no longer revolutionary.
Right. It was, it's conservative at that point. But so I want to make sure that, especially for those who might not be, so for me, I'm somewhat familiar of the English Civil War, partially because I studied law, and I was fascinated with the long history of like English civil law and how that all, like common law, actually, how the common law system like stretches back to medieval times in some senses, then feudal times in others, but has this like this interesting like reformist kind of mode in which we are still tied in some ways to the vestiges of medieval feudal and early capitalist land relations, and the way we talk about fee simple absolute in our property relations and things like that. But I was also interested in and really kind of informed on the nitty gritty of the particulars of the English Civil War and the Revolution. I would say that it is through Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, which is I think a really good podcast, and I think it's the first one of that podcast that he was going through the English, and you hear about Cromwell and all the different aspects of that. But I think if you could, as difficult as it is, sketch a bit of an outline history of the dynamics that are going on in the important events. I think even I would helpfully, which Mike Duncan doesn't necessarily do, from that kind of Marxist perspective, understanding this development of class relations. And we've obviously talked about it, but how are these developments, both in technology and the introduction of free trade and things like that, bubbling up to events that we would call a revolution? I mean, it's your book is The London Revolution. What are we talking about in terms of the events?
Well, that's quite a question.
Yeah, admittedly.
The revolution, let's see if I can do it this way. The revolution in England in general, so let's start here. The revolution led to the Civil War. The Civil War did not lead to the revolution. The revolution was completed to a degree. We always have to keep all our proportions guarded when we talk about these things. Mm-hmm. After the Civil War, after the military defeat of the king. But the revolution in London, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, tends to get a lot less attention. But it came these days. But it came before the Civil War. It's what led to the Civil War. the armed occupation of the streets by the middling people, by the Puritan movement, the city militia, which are called the trained bands, went over to the people. There was an election for the London Common Council in November of 1641, which replaced much of the old oligarchy with new, mostly Puritan and pro-parliament people. So there were a number of things that were going on politically. Once the king had fled, the feudal government, what was left of it, collapsed. And on the one hand, Parliament emerged as the national government, and the London government took over, the revolutionary London government now, took over the municipal area. And the two worked very closely, hand in hand, in this period. What happened afterwards is particularly interesting. Now, when I say they worked hand in hand, what this really represented was the alliance that I mentioned earlier between the gentry, who occupied almost all of the seats in the House of Commons, and the Puritan movement leadership, part of which were the Puritan preachers, ministers, divines, but the key component of which were the Atlantic merchants, because they had the money, they had the economic wherewithal, but they were both united in their opposition to the king. They wanted different things. The mass of the people, I mean, the Puritans were divided, as I said, between Presbyterians and Independents. Presbyterians wanted a new state church that everyone would have to belong to, just as it had always been the case in the medieval period. The Independents wanted a certain amount of tolerance. They were a much smaller grouping within the general Puritan movement. But this was a real difference. But in this early period, they were united in carrying out the revolution. In fact, they agreed not to criticize each other until the king had been driven from London. Eventually, of course, this led to the Civil War. It was long and bloody. Many important events, not particularly the battle so much, although those were obviously important, but other events occurred, particularly because the parliamentary army was largely made up of the same yeomen and craft workers, the middling people from both urban and rural, radically Puritan. And now they had arms in hand. They were organized into an army, particularly under Cromwell and the New Model Army. This was a really revolutionary army. For the first time, you had promotion by merit. It didn't matter what religion you were. The officers were no longer automatically nobles. They were chosen on the basis of competence, and all of this made a great deal of difference. You then had, when the king was finally defeated, well, there was a lot of political jockeying between the Independents, the Presbyterians, Parliament, the army, and the rank and file soldiery of these same middling people. It's long. It's somewhat long. It's somewhat convoluted. It's a fascinating period.
Absolutely.
What it eventually led to was the execution of the king, which was basically what the army ranks were demanding, and the establishment of the what they called the Commonwealth, a republic by another name.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this, particularly in terms of the army ranks, the impetus came from the group known as the Levelers.
Yeah, and that was something I think, when if you're reading Marxist stuff and you kind of are more interested in 19th century, you'll hear about the Chartists in England. But in this period, you have the Levelers, and I was introduced to them in Mike Duncan's podcast, and they were kind of fascinating to me, and I did a little bit of reading and learning about them, because I think I would say that's part of the long tradition that I would even consider myself a sort of part of. So, who are the Levelers, and what is their program? What is their role? Like, how did they come about? Can you give us a bit of a background on how they kind of fit into this story?
So my book ends before the organized Leveler Party appears,
Mm-hmm.
but its leaders do make appearances. They had been radicals for quite some time, and its significance is discussed. The Leveler Party was the incipient leadership of the petty bourgeois middling people against not only the king, but against also the larger capitalists and merchants, the small master artisans, the shopkeepers, traders, mariners, yeomen, so on. They were radical Democrats, and they were what made them especially important was that they were the first to develop a secular political program, whereas the Puritan, most of the Puritan leaders and Parliament, or the House of Commons anyway, always phrased things in terms of Protestantism, the need to defend Protestantism, or the need to have a Presbyterian church, whatever. The Levelers developed a secular political program. They advocated based on sovereignty, that the idea that sovereignty derived from the people. Mm-hmm. They advocated for a major expansion of voting rights, electoral reform, equality before the law, religious tolerance, an abolition of debtors' prison, tithes, and the monarchy. They encouraged women to be activists in the party, and many were. And as I said, they were influential among the soldiers of the new model army. It was really their influence, and the ranks of the army that pushed Cromwell to execute the king in 1649. They also influenced some of the soldiery in the new model army not to enlist to go to fight in Ireland against the Catholics. Their idea of democracy was their program was written in the agreement of the people. They wanted to have people sign it and endorse the program as a way to activate and organize their participation in government. Cromwell betrayed them by preventing this. This is kind of akin to the suppression of the far left wing, the Hébertists, by the Jacobins in the French Revolution. And it should be pointed out that they were, as important as the Levelers were, they were not the most radical at the time. For one thing, as the party of the middling people, they were not for simply abolishing the existing estates. In fact, they protested vehemently that wasn't true. And how could they be? Because the petty bourgeoisie also owned property. Sure. Right? So they had to defend it. The middling people just wanted a chance to become larger and wealthier. Mm-hmm. And felt they were being blocked, which they were, by the bigger capitalists. Excuse me. The most radical group was the Diggers, led by Gerard Winstanley, who was a very early form of a communist.
Yeah, so I mean, if we kind of trace that, I mean, if you can think of the Levelers potentially as maybe liberal Democrats, not necessarily wanting to disrupt property relations as they kind of exist or something like that, but wanting to make it, more accessible to more people, or to a certain strata of people. Whereas you have the Diggers wanting to dig up in some ways and just tear down much of the existing social, political, economic system.
Well, even the diggers. I mean, the diggers represented was based on the very poor people, day laborers and people who really had next to nothing. And their idea was that they wanted to plant food on the common ground, on the common lands. But this did not hold well with even many of the smallholders, people who engaged in subsistence farming. Because the commons were where they pastured their very, one or two animals that they owned that were absolutely crucial to them to maintain themselves. And of course the gentry, the upper classes, were completely opposed to this idea that the land belonged to everybody. So they were very cruel, and the diggers were very cruelly and easily dispersed. The levelers, there were a couple of half-hearted insurrections in the army, influenced by the levelers, but they never. They were also pretty easily put down by Cromwell and the army grandees, as they were called. And it's what caused, their suppression was what forced Cromwell eventually to have to form the Protectorate, because having overthrown the king, having excluded, abolished monarchy, the House of Lords, having excluded most of the gentry from the House of Commons, their base was extremely narrow. And when they prevented the levelers from propagating the agreement of the people, it left them with a very narrow, it left the independents with a very narrow social base that ultimately couldn't hold. And that was the source of the short-term failure of the revolution. And led to the restoration of the monarchy. But again, it wasn't the same monarchy as had existed under Charles I before the revolution. How could it be? It was no more possible to turn the clock back to the pre-revolutionary period than Mary Tudor could have abolished the Reformation that her father started. But it did last for almost 30 years. I call it the real interregnum. That is the interregnum not based on the monarch, whether there was a king on the throne, as is conventionally done, but whether or not, but that the interregnum between the start and the completion of the bourgeois revolution, which came about in 1688.
So yeah, and so there is this standard historiography of this period of time when you have a regicide, the actual killing of a king, which is, I think, a pretty momentous occasion in feudal Europe, obviously, and the creation of a kind of republic, essentially. But when I think that you, as because it's a longer period and things like that, in England, as we've discussed, is a bit of a different animal than potentially the rest of Europe. When you see the death of the king in France, it's the establishment of a republic, and yes, you have a restoration in terms of an emperor coming back, and so there's fits and starts, but there becomes a kind of obvious point if you look at as it develops into the modern period, connecting the English Revolution to the modern period. You don't have a House of Lords in France or in Italy. I mean, you could potentially say that maybe there's a pseudo House of Lords in the United States in terms of the Senate, and that's an interesting discussion. But at minimum, you don't have at least the title Lord, in some of the republics that have gone that have went through revolutions. And so yes, there's still the existence of essentially constitutional republics, I guess, in Sweden and in the Netherlands, and obviously in England. And so for me, especially not understanding all of the history, especially of the Civil War and what comes after it, including the Restoration and such, the continued existence of the House of Lords and the ability for there to be at least the what appears to be the vestiges of feudalism, a remainder of having a literal king. I mean, even Cromwell was not willing, for I think a lot of different reasons, to like take up the mantle of king. Um, you do have still a Queen of England and like kings of other places, and so the role of the House of Lords in terms of I think as it connects to what they were doing during this period of revolution, and then it kind of develops. How would it, if you were to advise a person who is frustrated by the continued existence of this seemingly feudal body, what is its role, and why do you think it still exists as a way to kind of help us understand what the English civil what the sort of revolution and then the Civil War and the period that comes after it tells us about the England of today?
Yeah, so the House of Lords and the monarchy are indeed leftovers from the feudal era. And to see them in the modern world is quite ludicrous. It's a direct result. I mean, historically, it's a direct result of the gentry's leadership in the London Revolution and Civil War, the political skew that I mentioned earlier. And that led to the hybrid arrangement after the revolution in 1688, where the nobility, the aristocracy, and the bourgeoisie shared political power. The role of the House of Lords, the monarchy today, is still no less reactionary than it was then. The only difference is that today it helps to prop up the decaying capitalist system. So look, Marx wrote that the alternatives for humanity are socialism or barbarism. And I think all one has to do is look around to see that we are moving at a pretty good clip towards barbarism today.
Yeah.
So whatever form barbarism may take, and it could be a new world war, fascism, economic or environmental collapse, the point is that they're all rooted in the capitalist profit system, which ceased being progressive more than 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. The English Revolution serves as an example, both positive and negative, of how an outmoded social system can and must be replaced. My book is an attempt to draw the appropriate historical lessons.
Well, I mean, I think that's what's necessary. I do think that I think one of the things when I was reading your bio and stuff like that, the attempt to push against a kind of bourgeois historiography that doesn't want to talk about that want to talks about kings and great men of history or something like that, and doesn't realize that these important events, these momentous events in history, are often the case of the clash of new technological developments and new social systems butting up against an ossified and decaying system. And yeah, I agree with you. I think the idea that if somebody were to tell someone even in 1922, much less 1900, that in 2022 we'd still be talking about the need to end capitalism, would be a major surprise, because the need and the obvious decadence, decay, and necessity of overcoming capitalism was so apparent already then, and actually possible then, that it would seem almost crazy to have to do it. But here we are, and I think for me it's partially trying to use the technology of the day, the podcast in some ways, to get these ideas out there, is a way of trying to advance the ball forward to the world that we need. And I think I was very excited to sort of hear about your book, and because I think for most people history is a boring subject of names and dates, and when you understand what history really is, it's not. It's this exciting story of lessons we can learn and examples we can follow and examples not to follow. And I think that in reading your book, it was one of those where as convoluted and complicated as the history of the English Revolutionary and Civil War period is, to be able to get a bit of clarity on how the forces in society come about, what they're doing, and the role that they play is instantly relatable to the world that we live in now, so long as you actually just, don't see the book as a simple exercise in academic, history, but see it as a kind of means by which to take up a mantle and fight our fight. And so to that, I think I am, having read your book, indebted to you and the work that you're doing. So I greatly appreciate it. And I would, obviously, anybody listening to this episode who's interested or might have, just stumbled upon the Revolutions podcast and just got through that, read Michael's book and learn some of the lessons that you might not get from Mike Duncan's, as good as those are. So, Michael, thank you. I really appreciate it. And let's we can stay in touch. And
Sure.
There's obviously the Netherlands that we even touched on that is interesting. But I think even touching a bit, learning a bit more about the lessons that you've learned in the course of your political life. We're of, I think, one political perspective, but in two different generations. And I think too often, younger folks, specifically those who may be are what we might call terminally online, are not learning some of the lessons, the good lessons from those who have gone before, and I think that would be necessary. So I'd love to have you on to, pick your brain a bit about how you see what's going on and the ways that we can move the ball forward.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
All right, cool. Well, on that note, have a good one. Stay warm and stay safe, and we'll talk to you later.
Take good care.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right. See you next time.